Welcome to Community Liberation Podcast, a podcast about applying revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice. My name is Geraldo, and I am an organizer with Community Liberation Programs, or CLP. CLP is a multinational scientific socialist mass organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We currently run decolonization programs in Oakland and San Francisco, such as our Oakland Chinatown Grocery Distribution Program and our SF Mission Youth Street Medic Program. We also regularly hold public political education events and classes. To learn more about our programs, you can follow us on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs, and you can support our Buy Me a Coffee and Give Butter in the show notes below. This podcast and any other decolonization programs we put on is for the people and are 100% funded by grassroots donations like yours. All right, so in this episode, we are going to have a more special episode discussing Wretched of the Earth and its connections to other texts and other movements in the current time. And it's also related as a kind of supplementary podcast for our upcoming reading group, which is going to be on October 5th at 1 p.m. online. So you can check that out. And hopefully this podcast will go out on Saturday so folks can check out that before they dive into the reading group.
And the reading group is running for how many weeks?
And the reading group is running for around 8 weeks. So it's every week, 1 to 3 online Pacific Standard Time. And this is kind of a perfect opportunity to introduce my co-host.
Right. So Geraldo will be joined today by me, Dob, another organizer with CLP. I'm happy to be here, happy to talk a little bit about Fanon and about Wretched. I think today our objective is to really just give a little bit of context and background to this work and to Fanon himself as a person. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we would definitely want to do some background stuff on Fanon and then maybe dive in a little bit into maybe the preface and chapter 1. So getting started, we can maybe just open up the floor just to kind of start talking about Frantz Fanon, who he was, and Wretched of the Earth. So I can get started just a little bit. But, Wretched of the Earth is a kind of a large text, and I think you can't really talk about the book without talking about Frantz Fanon as a person. So he was born in 1925 on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, which continues to be a French colony to this day. And I think recently, a couple of years ago, there actually was like a huge protest movement that was happening. But he was born on Martinique in 1925. And he was influenced by his high school teacher, which was Aimé Césaire. So Aimé Césaire is a prominent figure in the Negritude movement. He also authored the prolific text Discourse on Colonialism, which influenced many of Fanon's concepts on decolonization, the metropole, and Western Europe's influence over the colonized. After he finished secondary school, he was enlisted in the Free French Forces to fight the Nazi invasion of France. And there he experienced Nazism and French fascism and the racist attitudes towards the Free French forces towards African soldiers. In 1951, he was a resident in psychiatry, and he completed his dissertation in psychiatry with the also prolific book that folks probably know, Black Skins, White Masks, that goes over the alienations of Africans under colonialism. And in 1953, he was transferred to Algeria, became a practicing psychiatrist, and observed the psychological effects of colonization on both the colonized and the colonizer. He treated both police officers, Algerian children, wives of prominent French colonizers, and tortured National Liberation Front militants. And with all that experience, he was disillusioned by what he was experiencing, and he joined the FLN after kind of doing some social investigation on the material conditions of Algeria. And after that, he with the FLN, he did a lot of work with them. He was on the propaganda newspaper. He was in the provisional government as an ambassador to Ghana, and ultimately wrote toward the African Revolution, which was a posthumous book of his travels throughout Africa. While he returned to Tunisia, he was diagnosed with leukemia, was sent to the Soviet Union for treatment, and the treatment worked. He was in remission, but his symptoms began to continue despite being in remission. So he obviously saw that his life was not going to last very long. So he continued to dictate his theories of decolonization with the text that would be known as The Wretched of the Earth. In 1961, he was transferred to the United States, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, arranged his treatment at the National Institute of Health. And the CIA kept him in a hotel in Bethesda before he was getting any treatment. And ultimately, he contracted pneumonia and died in 1961 at the age of 36. So that's just a general background to Fanon. I know there's definitely a lot more there, but that's just kind of the summary of it. But Dob, do you want to go into Wretched of the Earth and kind of the background to that?
Sure. I mean, I guess first, something that I find very interesting about Fanon's own background is that he found himself embroiled in a revolutionary struggle that, he doesn't actually that's not his own sort of cultural background necessarily, right? Like he uh went to Algeria initially as a psychiatrist, and uh, in through his work, he ended up drifting towards and eventually joining the FLN and becoming a figurehead within the Algerian independence movement. But yeah, I do find that point very interesting. I also really find it interesting that the CIA decided to help treat Fanon. I think this is a bit of interesting historical background that maybe I'll just take a quick detour through. So, we mostly think today of the CIA as like the premier um, anti-communist reactionary institution in the world, really. But but the context in the 1960s was somewhat different, and I think people could reflect on it a little bit. And you know, things change a lot with time, right? So the U.S. at after World War II was actually largely seen in a much more positive light across a lot of the so-called third world and so on. And because the US had not been significantly involved in things like like the partition of Africa or like the colonization of the Americas and so on, besides, well, the colon, but maybe not South America, but they were not necessarily the um one of the big focuses of the anti-colonial movements, right? A lot of the initial focus was on countries like France and Belgium and the UK. Uh, and then of course, the US got involved in places like Korea, places like Vietnam, but for a good while, the CIA tried to masquerade itself as a sort of almost progressive organization, right? They were a significant um, contributor to some areas of critical theory, right? They funded the what was that? What is that organization called again? The something for cultural, a committee for cultural something, right? So I think that sort of ex helps explain a little bit why the CIA would try to help Fanon, or like air quotes help Fanon. I think that's just a bit of interesting background. But yeah, so getting started on the book. Well, the book is really a collection of essays, right? It's a collection of essays that Fanon wrote throughout his time as a psychiatrist and his time working with the FLN. Uh, and well, actually, let me hand it over to you. Do you have any other Do you have other background that you want to get started on with the book?
Yeah, I guess with in terms of like Rich of the Earth, like a lot of it was like kind of at least in terms of the book was written, kind of with his mindset that his life wasn't really going to last much longer. So a lot of the text is kind of has was written by him, but also was dictated to his wife, who would down, write down his dictation. So it the book kind of is a little bit jumbled because it was released, I think. It was yeah, it was published several weeks posthumously after he passed, and his wife was basically the one that kind of took it on. And so putting this all together, in a quick moment, especially when he was a very influential person and had very influential thoughts, the chances of getting this published and getting on top of it was really important, especially at the time when this was published in 1961. This is right before like the big anti-colonial movements and kind of like the shift from colonialism with like the like Great Britain, France, etc., to post-colonialism, neo-colonialism. So there was definitely a kind of urgency to get this book out. And ultimately, it kind of shows through that. It's a collection of essays. It's a collection of kind of dictation that you could definitely see that, and this kind of brings it into another sidetrack of like another book that we will be referencing is Meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. We'll touch on that maybe a little bit later, but this book goes over James Yaki Sayles' understanding of the text, and he basically states that like basically Fanon's talking in multiple voices and multiple different perspectives at different points of his very fleeting life to get this book out. So it definitely is kind of a disjointed book, but it is a book that was kind of put together in haste because there was a very much a necessity for his theory to get out there at least in the French speaking world, but definitely once it was hit in the English speaking world, it's very influential.
So sorry, who is James Yaki Sayles? Maybe you could remind us.
Yeah, so James Yaki Sayles, he is or was a New African revolutionary who was imprisoned for since he was 16, and he was imprisoned for I think around like 33 years. He got out in when he was like in his 40s or 50s, if I remember correctly, and he only lived like a couple of years after that. He James Yaki Sayles was a very prolific revolutionary. He started multiple different New African organizations in prison. One of them is called a Rebuild Collective, which is kind of what grew out of his passing, the Rebuild Collective. But he also had the New African Prison Organization, which was a fairly large and active organization within New African communist movements in the prison system. And he, very much like Fanon, he was very interested in getting this politic out there, and especially in the later life of James Yaki Sayles, he was also dying of cancer and was also trying his best to get the Meditations on Wretched of the Earth out before he died. And so the book, kind of serendipitously goes over that kind of experience of him trying to get people to understand a little bit more deeper the theory of Wretched of the Earth, from a New African communist perspective, as opposed to what he saw was like a wily intellectual co-option of the text. And so James Yaki Sayles, he continues to be an influential figure in the New African movement today. Rebuild Collective is still around. They still publish quarterly newspapers, as well as influence a lot of the current political prisoners that are still fighting for the freedom, like Shaka Shakur. So that's kind of like a general background of James Yaki Sayles and the book Meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth.
Yeah, I mean, as I recall, it's been a while since I read it, but a big part of his focus is trying to um push back against these alternative alternative readings of Fanon. You could call them like maybe liberal readings of Fanon. I forget who exactly was that professor that academic that he frequently rails against in meditations. I don't know if you recall the name of that.
I remember her last name. Her last name is Wyrick. I think it's Deborah Wyrick.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
She wrote Frantz Fanon for Beginners, and he was sent that in prison, and he was inspired to actually write meditations because of that book. But there was also other inspirations as well, like Ron Karenga's Us. He wrote a thing about Wretched of the Earth, stating that the petite bourgeoisie are going to be the revolutionary vanguard of the Black community from a cultural nationalist perspective. And then he also like has like digs at Cornell West and some other people as well.
Yeah, yeah. That's that all sounds familiar. That's posting in the 1980s. So I think that helps bring us to our uh sort of introduction to the work itself, right? This the general intellectual and theoretical background of the work, and how it connects to or relates to present day struggles, which I do think that this is one of the works from that time period that is still perhaps extremely relevant, and not just in terms of a work that we can use to study historical background, which I think is always important. There's a lot of works like that which should be historically situated when we read them. But Wretched is a work that works, I think, still even without the historical context, or rather, I what I mean to say is that it's more of a timeless work, because I think what sets it apart from a lot of other theoreticians at the time is that Fanon is still at his core a psychiatrist, right? Um, a lot of his theorizing is about these sort of fundamental movements of the psyche, which I think is really interesting. I mean, this is around the same time that a lot of psychoanalysis and other other types of additions to Marxism start to take off. But maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. First, we can talk a little bit about the political connections to the present day, so like neo-colonialism and national liberation struggles today.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to piggyback on what you were talking about. James Yaki Sayles has a good quote on page 49. He says, while reading Wretched, it's of course necessary to base ourselves on the concrete reality of one out of which it came primarily what it speaks to. However, we must also be able to see the general and the particular, and the particular and the general, and to recognize the extent to which our reality is being described and critiqued, the extent to which Fanon points the way toward for us. So yeah, kind of yeah, he definitely tries to bring that forward. And I think, in the present day, I think Fanon is very applicable. And I think, you know, I think a big kind of cataclysmic event that's obviously going on right now is the genocide in Gaza. But I think the precipice, what kind of ignited a huge schism within the general left, but also within the general quote unquote movement was October 7th. And this is a kind of ironic because it does also illuminate another kind of Fanon wily intellectual, Adam Schatz, who wrote a biography on Fanon. And right after October 7th, he condemned the anti-colonial violence of Palestinians as being, this like reactionary force, as opposed to going about it in a more peaceful way. As a person who did a biography on Frantz Fanon, But I think October 7th was a key example of like how why this is applicable. Revolutionary violence, and not just like Fanon doesn't just talk about revolutionary violence. He also talks about the creation of a new person, and I think October 7th and the creation of the movements that came out of that definitely reignited revolutionary violence and the discussion about revolutionary violence, as well as the creation of new people in the face of revolutionary violence. So I think that's one thing I kind of see currently.
Yeah, I think Fanon's work in general still is I think so there are parts like you said with that fantastic quote from Yaki Sayles. There are parts that are particular, right? And there are parts that I think can be generalized. And I think a big part of what can be generalized, especially to current neo-colonial formations and national liberation struggles, is um, the way that he traces the sort of psychological movement of the masses, right? And I think you can see plenty of examples of things, movements playing out exactly the way that Fanon would have predicted. And that's something that we'll definitely get into more in later episodes once we dive more deeply into the work. But I'll just say now that, Fanon has this particular analysis of uh, nationalist movements and how they interact with socialist movements, the differences between them, and also how those can interact with these sort of ancien forces of tribalism and shamanism, right? And uh, those are those are forces that we still see active today. Just as an example, I think you can see here in the U.S., right? Uh, we do have an absence of like of like a sort of significant socialist movement, and what that results in is that. So I think this is a bit of a tangent, but we can definitely view the situation in the U.S. as a sort of internal neo-colonial situation, right? And as a result of that, you do have the same sort of psychological tensions at work that Fanon describes. And as people are increasingly immiserated and as people are increasingly um, put upon, you see exactly what Fanon describes. You see this uh, initial reaction, this turn towards tribalism and shamanism, right? But shamanism today is like a very different thing from what you might have seen in like a traditional sort of um, Algerian context, but uh, it's still the same general phenomena, right? Instead of like these what is the term? These like traditional African shamanistic practices. You have like the QAnon shaman or whatever, right? You have belief in like 5G interfering with your brain and other things like that, right? And those are sort of manifestations of that immiseration that Fanon describes in his works. I think that's just one example of that. And yeah, I mean, I'll leave it there. I wonder if you have anything to add on to that.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the effects of like internal neo-colonialism, I think there's definitely kind of right-wing kind of tribalism and kind of shamanistic kind of practices, especially within the right wing. There's kind of this return to, oh, I forget the name, like what the thing is, like return, right? Return to like the Roman Empire, or like pagan Viking stuff, or like return to this cottage core like settler aesthetic. And this especially like is very prominent within like white Euro Americans, but I think it also is still like very much within like even like oppressed communities too, that are not um they don't see themselves as like not American. They see themselves as American, assimilated. And then I think in terms of the like the left wing, we do see like we saw kind of and I do think this was like an important like development, and I do think like this is not something that like Fanon also talks about like this like shamanistic aspect and like tribalism was obviously important because it does illuminate more contradictions and it does actually bring forth a more cohesive understanding of colonialism. But I do think on like the left, post October 7th, I don't know what the statistics are, but I have noticed that a large majority of people on the left have, reverted to Islam or have gone back to, their religious aspects that they were, a part of, or became more, inclined to follow Islam as a revolutionary religion. Um, and I do think that is like, kind of a more positive or more revolutionary development in kind of like that shamanistic or tribalism that Fanon does talk about, and that it has like the potential to then develop into something more revolutionary, as opposed to also Fanon does critique is like the kind of right wing kind of like false consciousness of like the going like the return the going back to cottage core kind of like ideologies, or like even like the QAnon shaman, there are two sides of the different coin, uh and to see where it's developing in certain communities and where it's developing in others, and how to bring it forth to a more revolutionary ideology is something that I think Vedant does touch on. I do think we see that today, like it's either like return to cottagecore settlerism or go towards a more revolutionary like Islamic understanding of the world, and revolutionary like program. Um, but that's kind of like some of the things I noticed. But in terms of like within the core, within the neo-colonialized settler capitalist, U.S. like socialist movements are developing, though they are developing in also their own different kind of or different kind of ways. But that's kind of another conversation for another day. But that's kind of like my thoughts on like the kind of shamanistic or tribalism that Fanon talks about. But with regards to like other stuff with Wretched, I think one really interesting thing I think we can also touch on a little bit more is like his discussion on violence and like the penetration of violence from a like psychological perspective. One is kind of coming from like a Marxist scientific socialist perspective, like a deeper dive of like violence in the colonial context as a liberating like a tool, but also in the hands of another and the colonizer, it is a tool for repression and kind of instilling fear within the colonized. And I think we also see this currently too. There is a big debate going on about what does escalation look like, what does violence look like, uh what does like the assassination in quotations of Charlie Kirk mean, what does this violence even mean, and I think like there is that kind of questioning of that, and I think there is definitely a misunderstanding of what revolutionary violence is, but also a misunderstanding of what violence really is to begin with. And I think that is kind of like where we could kind of go a little bit next. So, Dalb, if you have any thoughts on like the concept of violence and revolutionary violence that Fanon talks about.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I actually think that a lot of people's perspectives on violence have changed a lot, not from October 7th, but from internal political developments in the US, at least over like the last 5 years or so. And I actually think that the left at large in the US is like really behind the curve in terms of, or like, let's say the institutional left in the US is really behind the curve in terms of understanding the role of violence in political in political contestation, right? Uh, so recently, so I saw a survey just earlier today. I didn't really read the details of how this survey was done or how the responses were collected, but it suggested that basically like 30% of Americans now see like political violence as the only way to get through America's current like crises or whatever, right? And the funny thing is, like, I think if you survey the left, I mean, depends on it really depends on who like classifies themselves as such, and a lot of people who are really liberals will classify themselves as being left, but I think that percentage might actually be lower than this average of like 30% that they got in the survey. Um, and there's been a few other developments. If any listeners familiar with the Twitter micro celebrity Nicholas Decker, so he wrote that, or they wrote that. I'm not sure of their pronouns. That sort of infamous essay a few months back, maybe almost like half a year ago, probably or more, called "When do we kill them?" I think that's the title of the essay, right? And the idea behind the essay is basically that, when words fail, you have to, pull out the AR-15, right? And it's really funny because Nicholas Decker is on Twitter he has the Ukraine flag in bio, etc. And he's a diehard liberal, but a liberal in like the very like sort of militant sense of the word, in which he understands that liberalism is not necessarily hegemonic anymore, and so it has to enter this contestation with these competing ideologies of fascism and socialism, right? So I do think that it is interesting that people are starting to recognize the important political like role of violence. Like violence is sort of uh the last guarantor of civil society, right? Like underneath all the laws and stuff like that, at the end of the day, society is held together by, you know, the I like some there's always some threat of violence, some sort of implied violence. And I think increasingly it's the only people left who are not getting this point are like the left liberal like Radlib sort of 50-51 protesters um, who yeah, I mean I've talked to a few of these people, and they just don't and they just don't agree on the idea that there is like this if there is an open violence, there's implied violence, and instead the idea I think we've all run into people whose idea of society is like everybody just happens to agree on everything. There's like um and we don't have to have like an armed forces or anything like that. Uh, but yeah, as far as revolutionary violence goes, sorry, that was a little bit of a sidetrack. But as far as revolutionary violence goes, I also see that becoming more prominent both on the far right and on the far left. I think this is a whole discussion, but it is really interesting to watch in real time, right? Just in the last few weeks we've seen so many instances of basically overtly political violence.
Yeah, yeah, and definitely you bring up a good point about the you know, that the left, I guess the institutional left, but even I guess even amongst like the uninstitutionalized left, there is a aversion to violence. Like the so-called left would be like, the Democrats, they constantly have been, ceding ground to violence and condemning it, while like the right utilizes it as like a rallying call for them. Look at the multiple attempted assassinations of Donald Trump. That obviously eliminated a lot of vigor with the right, and the institutional left was like, condemn it, whatever. And it could have been an opportunity, for them to at least claim something. However, I think with the uninstitutionalized left, the left that calls itself revolutionary, there is an aversion to violence, especially as we saw, in recent weeks, like the Charlie Kirk situation. Even last year, we saw with Elias Rodriguez um, incident where he killed two Zionist settlers, or even other institutions, where other organizations like Palestine Action US or all these other things are just doing property damage. Casey Goonan is another one I think of, who did property damage, and now he has almost like 30 years to life plus 15 monitoring once he's free. Like that's wild. Um, but yeah, no, I think there is definitely a version of violence, and I think we are seeing the development of that. And Fanon obviously like kind of is, interestingly enough, kind of predicting a lot of the psychoanalytical drive for a lot of people to go to violence. Why people do it? You know, a lot of the people that do go to violence, they are obviously seeing what's happening in Palestine, and they want to act on it because they feel like nothing is being done. And so they're attempting to push further than what is kind of conceived as the only thing to do. But we also see that with the right. Like the right is obviously doing the same thing, but like pushing a more, theocratic and right wing ideology by doing specific, targeted attacks on churches or mosques or, et cetera, or individuals, or, attacking oppressed communities and that kind of stuff. Or joining ICE, which I think is the big one. Like, a lot of these vigilante types are joining ICE because ICE is like pretty not that difficult to get into, and then terrorizing, communities all throughout. Or they don't even have to join ICE. They just put on an ICE giddy up and then terrorize their communities, uh, just to sow that, political violence.
Well, now, nobody even on the right wants to join ICE, or at least they're all talking about how like Trump let ICE down, right? There was that video of the ICE of the uh ICE officer like shoving a detainee, and the detainee shoved him back, and then the ICE officer was suspended. I think there was a whole snafu on the right about that. They were like, who's going to join ICE now if Trump doesn't have their backs? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting contradictions there. I think, there it's interesting because I think there are definitely certain sections on the right and left, on the far right and the far left, that are more inclined to violence and are even willing to, understand the sort of legitimacy of violence from the other side. For example, like for example, like if I were to, I mean, to see like or to witness or to experience some sort of like, right-wing violence in our community, it's terrible. I mean, I would not, I would rally against it, but my move would not be to be like, oh, this is like completely against all the, this is like against decorum. This is like frowned upon in civil society, and we should be settling things by, talking. And why can't they just, why can't we just settle our differences through debate, facts over feelings, whatever. And I think instead I would encourage, all of my friends and family to begin arming themselves and training themselves and so on. And I see some people on the far right and the far left taking this approach towards the other side. But at the same time, like I think there is still big swaths of the middle, and they're obviously supported by most of mainstream media, that have this, uh, you know, the thing is that after, so how like after the Kirk assassination, there was so much debate over whether the shooter was like right wing or left wing, whatever that means. And it was in fact like all the leftists were trying to claim that the shooter was right. All of the like quote air quotes leftists were trying to claim that the shooter was right wing, and all of the right wingers were trying to claim that the shooter was left wing. Like I think that in itself is a sign that there's still a ways for this contradiction to develop. Not to say that like, oh, I love violence and violence is great, but I'm just saying that like we haven't, yeah, there's still a ways to go as far as people's understanding of the role that violence plays in political contestation.
Definitely. I think it kind of ties in a little bit into kind of the preface by Sartre to Richard the Earth. Um, I guess like a preface to the preface for the preface. Sartre, he and Fanon were colleagues. They talked quite a bit, and they even met in France as Fanon was going through, kind of thinking through the process of of Wretched the Earth, etc. So he was added to the preface of Wretched the Earth by his wife. However, he was ultimately removed later after he became a more ardent Zionist. And so, following publications of the book, he was removed uh, from Wretched of the Earth until the recent publication from Harvard with Richard Philcox. They re-added him back in without consulting Fanon's family. But anyhow, that's just like a background. But one of the things that he does talk about is that like in the last paragraph of the preface is that if we bury our heads, eventually the violence is going to come back to the metropoles. And I think that's like the big kind of discussion that's been that I see in left spaces is like the boomerang, the colonial boomerang, which I think is actually was not coined by Sartre, it was coined by Amy Césaire.
Yes,
But
Césaire, that's right. Yeah.
yeah, the colonial boomerang is like a kind of a big talking point right now, especially with like all the stuff that's going on. But there is like a truth to it. Like if we keep on burying our heads, like violence is going to come back to the metropole, to the core, to the to the United States. And I think that is very much. I think there's a probably obviously a bigger discussion about like are people willingly burying their heads, or like is there like a a base and superstructure for reason for why people bury their heads in the United States, because it is kind of isolated and insulated from violence, relatively speaking, for the more like upper Euro American populations in the United States, and their neo-colonial you know populations. But yeah, I think that is kind of like an interesting point that you just talk about, is like boomerang comes back, and that like at some point you have to reckon with it, and that the exploiter, the colonizer, and the citizen of a colonizing country is dehumanized as well by colonization. So I do think that is an interesting thing, and we kind of we've been touching on this with our discussions on revolutionary violence, but we are kind of seeing this kind of boomerang coming back. And I think the big things that people talk about are like Israeli tech surveilling everyone, or Palantir was used on Palestinians and on the border, and now it's being used on American citizens, et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty of examples with that. But yeah, I think that is kind of an interesting like kind of segue to that preface.
Yeah, I think the most interesting way in which the imperial boomerang is coming around. I mean, so this was coined by Césaire, and then Fanon also built upon this, and Sartre. So it's a very prominent theme in all of their works. But I think one of the main ways we're witnessing this imperial boomerang is basically the way that Trump is assaulting traditional U.S. allies, right? Like we may not necessarily see them as like a part of the U.S. because they're part of they're nominally independent and everything, but that's nominally, right? I mean, and in all but name, they're vassal states to the U.S. and the imperial boomerang, comes for them first. So you can see the U.S. beginning to like cannibalize like Europe, right? Cannibalize Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, right? I think that's one important way in which we actually have seen a lot of pushback against the U.S. from these countries because of that. Unfortunately, their elites are basically completely bought off by the United States. So there's not much that people can do about that short of an actual revolution. Um, but the other aspect of the imperial boomerang is basically that I think and this ties back into Frantz Fanon's sort of psychiatry background. And this is what you mentioned earlier too, right? Like the dehumanization of the colonized simultaneously distorts and destroys the psyche of the colonizer. And this is something that what's his name uh talks about in pedagogy of the oppressed, right? This is mentioned as well.
Yeah,
But
Paulo Freire.
yeah, Paulo Freire, yeah. So I mean that's a common theme, and the way that I works that I think it works, the way that I see it working is, you sort of internalize all of um these ways of thinking uh, about these lesser peoples, let's say, or about the global South, about foreigners or other countries and so on, and that really just becomes like a very distorted mental model for you to view the world with, right? Like something I've been thinking about recently is the way that uh, a lot of people will uh, immediately dismiss any positive things that somebody might say about the DPRK or about countries like that because it defies common sense, right? And like the way that common sense is invoked in this context is actually quite odd because like what is it based upon? It's not based like you have like most people have no like direct experience that could contribute to that uh to the conclusions generated by the so-called common sense, right? It's really just a very like a sort of it stems from the distorted worldview that essentially U.S. foreign policy has imparted upon its all of its citizenry, right? So it's like it's pathological in it's pathological really. It's like it's a brain work, the imperial boomerang. It's not just like, Palantir gets used on us too, yes. But it's also just, on the individual psychological level.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think on a psychological level, yeah, it does definitely like it affects everyone. It affects Euro Americans. It affects uh, people that come to the United States for whatever reason, and they internalize things. They even internalize things about their own country or home country, um, because the ideology is obviously here, but it like and it's very pervasive, but it also like it justifies and kind of explains for why you're here and why you're better than those savages that you came from or whatever. Just from my experience, like, and this is an anecdote, is this like last weekend standing in line for a restaurant in the Mission. It was a Nicaraguan restaurant that was closing, and it almost was like a SOS Nicaragua like meetup. Like the people around me were talking about how like evil dictatorial the Sandinistas are, and how like you uh can't talk bad about the government or whatever. And then in the same breath, they're like, "Oh my god! Like when I was living there, like it was a backwater, but now when I come back, it's like super industrialized." And it's like it's such an interesting kind of cognitive dissonance that coming to this country, you're obviously being harmed by the ideology, this like settler ideology that is like purposely justifying destroying your own home country, and you internalize it, and you're justifying it, and you can kind of justify bombing your home country, very much like a lot of like Iranians, or they would call themselves Persians. There was a segment of them that were cheering the bombing that the United States was doing as well as Israel. And we see that, with Syria. Syria is another big one where like Syrian, people here were like cheering the destruction of like Assad's government, and then now are conveniently silent about the genocides and all that stuff that's going on there. So yeah, like the colonizer is definitely harmed psychologically, and also like the neo-colonialized that are also colonizers in some degree, just because they're standing in like the world system, uh, you know, is also like harmed and justify their own like kind of self-destruction as well. So I think that's interesting, and kind of a horrific development because of like colonization and like the kind of pervasive ideology that the United States does create.
Yeah, exactly. I think that this is what Fanon is really important for, these like understanding like this sort of the psychological aspects um of of colonization, how those psychological aspects can contribute to um mass movements and also, the contradictions of those psychological um movements, right? It's not so I mean, I think in a larger sense, what you have with the Imperial Boomerang psychologically is that you have all these people who come here, or people who are, European, Euro-American in origin, and they grow up and they completely internalize not just, these misconceptions and biased views of their home countries and the global South, but also this just this horribly distorted view of how the world works, right? They internalize basically a liberal worldview, right, which has its own intense contradictions. So they can claim that they have so much freedom and press and liberty here. Even as they can't find jobs, they're forced to live on the streets, and they're essentially forced into like uh, drug addiction and prostitution and all sorts of vice, all sorts of things like that. Uh, and they'll still say that, this is liberty and this is freedom, and it's better. Yeah. So I mean, I think that that's what, you know, that that cognitive dissonance that you talked about, like that's the psychological contradictions, deepening further and further, and eventually it causes a sort of break, right? Um, yeah, and I think yeah. I mean, for those who don't know, the part of the background that Fanon is working on, working within in terms of psychiatry is that, this is sort of the same era that Freud and Lacan and Nietzsche start to become very influential in the in leftist intellectual spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Fanon definitely draws upon some of those influences, and that's something we'll probably also get into as we move into the book. But first, actually, yeah, I wanted to maybe switch tacks a little bit, and talk about, what are and talk maybe a little bit more on what are some common misreadings of
Mm-hmm.
Fanon, right? So we talked about like how Fanon how the violence, the sort of, let's not say justification, but like the way that violence works politically is often overlooked. But what else? What do you think?
Yeah, I think in terms of like misreadings, I can't remember the quote from James Yaki Sayles. he talks about it um, in meditations, and I was just going over it this earlier today, and he I'll summarize it because I can't remember the exact quote, but he talks about how like a big misrepresentation that happens with like the reading of Fanon is actually like the cover or like the back of it, back of the cover with like reviews or whatever, or like the description and talking about like that Fanon's book is about anti-racism and like violence, or like Fanon's work is related to like civil rights and the slow march towards justice or whatever. And I think James Yaki Sayles definitely critiques this, and he does like kind of like precisely looks at like Weirich's like depiction of Fanon, especially with like Fanon for beginners. Um, but you see that with like you see that with Ron Karenga, like with us. Like he is a cultural nationalist. He was pushing an ideology of like integration with like the black capitalism and like the black bourgeoisie, as like this like kind of cultural nationalist vanguard, that's going to bring about some revolution maybe at some point, but probably not. Um, you see that with Cornel West. Like Cornel West is kind of like it's such an interesting like dichotomy that like Cornel West is like a quote, quotes this book or like holds this book in high esteem, but he's like basically like this like super nonviolent like liberal that will justify like the genocide of Palestinians because that might hurt, you know, to stop the genocide might actually hurt Israeli settlers. Um, and then we see with Rich of the Earth it gets co-opted by other people like even on the left, like people co-opt it, like with Adam Schatz, like he co-opted it to be like revolution has to be peaceful. Democratic socialists do the same thing. Marxist Leninists do the same thing, like as justifications for this book being like an aspect of like Marxism Leninism with Black thought, or whatever. Like there is a, and I think this is a big issue within like within everyone, within every movement and ideology. There is a need to co-opt and a need to like justify your opinion by like kind of like being revisionist or revising the ideas and thoughts of Fanon or revolutionaries. Um, but I think the biggest egregious ones, are the ones that kind of came out of like the BLM movement, like the neo-colonial movement, out of BLM. And I think Wretched of the Earth like inadvertently was neo-colonialized, especially in 2020 and 2020, but also 2016. And we do see a big like neo-colonial kind of like revisionist history and a revisionist interpretation of Fanon. And James Yaki Sayles touches on this, but I think if he was alive to see how far he was correct in that in this interpretation, we would see even more criticisms to like to the concept of neocolonialism, especially in the post Barack Obama uh, U.S. But yeah, I think that's one of the big things I noticed is like neocolonialism and kind of this like whitewashing of like revolutionary violence or violence in general from the book.
Yeah, I think what you brought up from Yaki Sales is really like the main thing that I see a lot too, right? This framing of Fanon as basically like a sort of anti-racist, like the sort of like what's his name? Like basically like Ibram X Kendi from like the 60s, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
like I think that's the way that a lot of people approach Fanon in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the way that he's framed in the academic canon. And
Mm-hmm.
then that's basically what they get out of Wretched. Ultimately, like, a lot of the times when you read a book, you sort of your preconceptions will influence like what you get out of it. And I think that's a lot of these people, I'm sure they've read parts of Fanon and they've actually read parts of Wretched, but yeah, they come at it from this point, from this perspective of, Fanon is this. um like Fanon is just asking, for like a recognition of the Black identity, a recognition of, the Native identity, and then, a lot of the psychological aspects. These are sort of recast as trauma to be voiced and healed in like clinics and workshops,
Mm-hmm.
rather than something that can be directed towards a national liberation movement, right? Like I feel like most of the in many of the contexts that you encounter Fanon in, you won't even hear like about national liberation, right? A lot of it's just um going to be like sort of in a in like the sort of modern DEI
Mm-hmm.
context, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is really funny.
Yeah, they kind of white fragility,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Fanon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and, yeah. I mean, we saw that with like Asada Shakur, like a very prominent organizing space. I won't say their name, called Asada Shakur an anti-racist organizer or something. But we see like like this co-option of this anti-racism is very prevalent, and it sells, right? Like to make Fanon a anti-racist like figurehead that you can put make panels or classes or like group therapy, anti-racist group therapy, right, fragility group therapy, whatever. Like you can profit off of it, and he has such a big name that why not? And I think academia definitely touches on this, and he will touch on it in subsequent chapters on the whitely intellectual, which is kind of ironic that he critiques it, but the whitely intellectual kind of out organized people's ability to actually read the text to then co-opt it. Um, yeah, I think there was something else I wanted to touch on with Fanon. I can't remember, so I'm gonna hold on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I'll let you recover your train of thought, but there's definitely this trend in okay, so how would I put this? I think there are like multiple ways in which I've seen Fanon read, in which I've seen Wretched read, and it's not always this sort of stereotypical liberal reading of Fanon. I think there are some readings that are very much like I would say even like sort of like there are readings that focus on the psychoanalytical aspect too, which I think are interesting. But a lot of them, something a lot of these have in common is that they erase the materialism from Fanon, right? They sort of erase the Marxism aspect, the socialism aspect, to kind of put it bluntly. Uh, and it's not to say that Fanon is like the most like diehard like orthodox Marxist or anything like that, because obviously he isn't. He's fairly innovative in the way that he thinks. But a lot of his thinking is for sure rooted in a very materialist outlook, and I think that that's the part that is missing from a lot of these discourses around Fanon. And I think a big reason for that isn't necessarily on the one hand, it's because people aren't like read Fanon in this particular way because they've been primed to view him as this sort of Ibram X. Kendi, but from like the 60s. But it's also like, like what can you get out of it? So, I mean, you're not going if you're not going to be able to actively promote like a national liberation movement, I guess, you know, the only thing you can do is just read Fanon as a way to diagnose psychiatric illnesses and have group therapy sessions, right? Um, yeah, I mean, okay, so the other thing that does sort of annoy me about the way that Fanon is read on the left and on the liberal left especially, is that there is this tendency to see to read Wretched uh, as a sort of I would say victimization narrative, right? There's a sort of there's a way to read it as it in a way that you're emphasizing the sort of victimhood, of the colonized, the victimhood of the a native versus the colonizer, and it very much fits into, where some recent events have gone, right? Like I think a lot of people have had the same attitude towards the Palestinian resistance. Um, there was that recent book by Muhammad Al-Kurd, right? What was the name of that, Geraldo?
Perfect victims, if I recall.
Yeah, yeah, something like that, right? Yeah, and I mean the idea behind it is that, they're like, Palestinians, other national liberation movements around the world, they're only worthy uh of sympathy, of your respect,
Mhm.
of your support if uh if they're these perfect victims, right? If sorry, give me a second.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's this like persistent ideology of like they have to be a perfect victim. They have to be like a woman or a child, and they have to be harmless, and they have to be crying or with their arms stretched out, or in some extreme cases, it's like they have to be a woman or a child or a dead child or
They can't be actively resistant.
yeah. You can't be resisting. You have to
You can't be
yeah
organized. You
yeah
have to ask other organizations to help you.
hmm
Yeah. You have to be reliant on you have to ask for the white savior,
hmm hmm yeah.
Yeah, so I think that really is one of the big misreadings of Fanon. That I often see, I mean, at least I often see him invoked in that sense, that Fanon, yeah. Uh that it's a description of how terrible colonization is. Which colonization is terrible, but what Wretched really is an analysis of what colonization does to the colonizer and the colonized, and a handbook for how to organize around this situation to create a progressive national liberation movement, right? It's it's not simply like a paean, like a to the horribly suffering victims of colonization.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think like the book, yeah, it's not like it's not the DSM of colonialism. It's he I mean like even like purposefully, and like I think it's like the first or maybe second chapter where he talks about like the need to stretch Marxism to the colonial question, the need to stretch Marxism beyond just like kind of the Euro Marxism. Um, and Fanon does provide that kind of template of like, and he provides it even further. Like he obviously studied like the current like the movements in Europe, but also the movements in Asia and China, and he saw the need to stretch it further. Um, and I think he wasn't afraid because he didn't really need to ascribe to it to kind of orthodox Marxism, uh, to critique and to move beyond kind of like Euro Marxism or Euro communism, as well as like some aspects of like Chinese socialism. I think like he was very critical of like the concept of like the vanguard party, um, that wasn't tied to a program for national liberation, and beyond that, which we'll talk about more, is like his criticism of like national liberation and like neo-colonialism that follows. um, and I think yeah, the book is a lot more than just like this like DSM for colonialism or something like that. Like it is a handbook on analyzing colonialism, but also analyzing the need to create uh, you know a unique scientific socialist understanding of the current conditions of things, and to enact it and to create revolution however you see fit within your specific context. And I think the perfect example of like a revolutionary that did take Fanon's like Wretched of the Earth like seriously and then actually enacted it would be like Amilcar Cabral, who like didn't really care to follow like Euro communism and like paved his own way. to create a more, African version of communism, an African communism, or as Yaki Sayles would say, a new African communism, where they return to the source of what African communalism was, and then actually project it in practice and actually enact a successful revolution. So yeah, I think those are kind of the parallels between that, between kind of liberal readings, even like left liberal readings, and like what we hope that people are able to get out of the text, especially in the reading group as well. Cool. I know we've been talking quite a bit on kind of the background and kind of our thoughts on kind of the general themes of like the preface and the book in general. But are there anything else? Is there anything else we want to touch on, Dob, regarding the book?
I think we covered a lot. I think we're about good, on the background. The one thing I'll leave the listeners with is you know, I think so what I was just talking about is how, or what we were just talking about is how there's all these different ways that people read Fanon, right? And the lens through which you read something always affects what you get out of it. And there's and there are all these different ways to read Fanon. And a lot of them are sort of politically motivated way readings, right? There are sort of orthodox Marxists that will read Fanon as like an orthodox Marxist. There are Nietzscheans who will read Fanon as a Nietzschean. Um, and so on. There are post-Marxists who will read Fanon as a post-Marxist. So I think the best way to read Fanon is really to just read it with an absolutely, open mind, really just try not to ignore the sections that maybe don't comport with what you thought Fanon was going to say, right? I think that's how I've gotten the most out of reading Wretched. So that would just be my one suggestion. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, that kind of tries at home. A quote that I read recently from James from Yaki. It's a longer quote, so I'll read it, but I do think it's important because it does touch on this kind of concept. Like, you know, we are obviously influenced by our ideologies, who we read, who we interact with, who we engage with. But the only way to really get to the source of Fanon is to actually read it for yourself and like be challenged by it. And James Yaki Sayles wrote um, on page 51, 1D, he states, whatever one gets from an easy read, for example, Fanon for beginners, will be less rewarding than what will result from a personal venture through the difficult process of going to the source, struggling with whatever obstacles one may encounter. You'll come away with a self confidence and an awareness appreciated all the more because it was achieved as a part of a self development undergone by a mastering of your fears, completing an intellectual process that you at first thought was too difficult to attempt. Such a process of self transformation and intellectual development is a central theme of Wretched of the Earth, stated explicitly or implicitly on nearly every page. Read Wretched for yourself. Study it. Take as much time as you think necessary. Don't be put off by any apprehensions or assumed complexity, wanting everything to come to you easy and fast. You are equal to the task. You'll get better as you go along. Dare to struggle with yourself and dare to learn and to apply what you learn to the transformation of your world. All right, I think that is a good way to end off the podcast. And so, with that, I'm going to end the podcast with our standard ending, which is, this was a podcast on kind of the background of Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. It's going to be titled probably Background on Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, episode 5, but it's going to be a multi-part series. But this is a podcast, community liberation by community liberation programs called Community Liberation Podcasts. And, we have been your hosts, Dob and myself, Geraldo. You can catch us on the ground at our programs, or you can also reach us at Instagram at Community Liberation Programs. or you can reach us at community or comlib programs on Twitter. You can also tap in with us on Medium at Community Liberation Programs, as well as other avenues as well. And you also tap in with us in the show notes below. But we hope to see you this Sunday and subsequent Sundays from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Zoom. We will be sending out emails, so please sign up. Hopefully, this podcast will go out before then, and we'll have the sign up link below. If not, you can also just check out us on Instagram and get tapped in. It's never too late to come to our reading group. You can always come in later and learn something new. So, thank you for coming out, and we'll see you next time.